Welcome to the Sound on Sound People and Music Industry podcast channel. We talk to engineer Dean James Barratt, looking at what it takes to be a successful mix engineer. That's the person who takes a raw multitrack and turns it into a polished sounding track. It's a role that requires both creativity and technical skill, and it's not an easy career to get into, but it can be a uniquely rewarding one. To explore this role, I'm joined by Dean James Barratt. He's a mix engineer whose credits include Shy FX, Joy Crookes, Ray BLK, James Vickery, Rag and Bone Man, Craig David, Jess Glynne and many more. Thanks for your time, Dean. Much appreciated. So, mixing is a notoriously competitive business. How did your own career get off the ground?
I mean, I started off on, I think, more of a traditional route, which might not be so common nowadays, but it was sort of making tea in recording studios and just, hanging about and trying to help out where I could. I was lucky enough to start working with there's a guy called Brian Chewett, who was he was the drummer in a ska band called Bad Manners, and he had a studio down in Guildford, which is close to where I kind of grew up. There's a lot of local bands cutting demos in there on Fostex sort of 16-track tape machines, and I think it was a Mackie desk, and it was a budget studio, but it was vibey. So I was able to kind of see how bands worked and recordings worked, but didn't get in too technical with everything because it was all a bit of a hit and hope, I think was it's a good sort of way to describe it. But so then I sort of just went to different studios. I worked with a guy called Kenny Denton, who did a lot of work in the 70s and 80s with a lot of different bands, and he worked at CTS doing a lot of film recording with orchestras, and he had his own studio in Chiswick, and I was signing on at the time, and it was the job seekers allowance that as a scheme the government did. I don't know if they do it anymore, but they allowed the employer to only pay you half of your wage, and then the government would make up the other half. It made a really good incentive then for people to take on like apprentices, I suppose, and things like that. So it was quite handy. So he only had to pay me half what he normally would, and I got to learn. I got a bit more in depth. I became, instead of making tea, I become more of a, because there was all these stages you had to go through as an engineer. It was making tea as tape op, just recording and arming the right tracks and playing it back and recording the right places, and also splicing tape together. There was Pro Tools there, but we didn't really use it at the time. And we slowly but surely I was able to kind of get on the desk, run the compressors and set the mics up. And then I moved. There was a new studio that was being built in Battersea called Sphere Studios, and it was a lot of the guys and staff from Air Studios. They'd kind of moved over. It was like Malcolm Atkin, Patty Nolder was the studio manager there, and it was built by a guy called Frank Camelli. He's now moved to LA with Sphere. The desk was bigger, the room was bigger, the clients were bigger, and the pressure and the stress was also bigger. So it's kind of, and also because it was a bigger studio, I kind of got demoted back down to, I was making tea again and setting on mics, even though I've been doing it for however many years. That was the route taken, and I think it kind of it pivoted then, because it felt like such a struggle, and you're always in the studio, and you're trying to move on, and it takes so much time. But I bumped into a guy, a good friend of mine now, Nitin Sawney, who had booked a session at Sphere Studios. He was actually doing an album for Cirque du Soleil at the time, and I got very involved as an assistant engineer and kind of became integral to the setup of everything. And they had to fly out to Canada to do all of the recording of the artists from the show, because the show was based out there. And he said, well, do you want to come with me? So I went out, and he got talking and basically said, I really need an engineer for all the stuff that I'm doing. would you be interested? And I jumped at the chance because I love all the stuff Nitin does, and the places he travels to, like, he goes all around the world recording. It was very appealing. So, and that kind of took me out of the big studios, which was probably the right sort of time, because it was at that point that a lot of them were closing down because it was a hard business, because the money wasn't really there to, justify £1,000 a day studio for writing and recording. It's, it was more rehearsal rooms. Everything was more programmed. Streaming had come in, so that all the physical sales were down massively. So it just kind of made sense to kind of leave that behind, but not forget what it had taught me. Then everything was very much in the box. So then my sort of learning all of the software and everything came from, going from completely one side to the other. But when we did do big recording sessions, it was great because we could go into the studios and, I knew how to use everything, and it was, like bouncing a ball really after the amount of time I'd spent doing it. So it was, it's basically through that. And then as time went on, I decided to get my own sort of production room, if you like, work in the box. But weirdly, slowly but surely, I've started getting more and more outboard again, because it's I just felt like something was missing with just in the box. It was just, there was something that, there's great records that are made in the box that actually probably couldn't be made with hardware. But the way I work is kind of mixing the two together, really. So I kind of do like a usual sort of, mix on the outboard and with the desk and everything, and then everything gets stemmed back into the computer for all the minor tweaks and pushes and analysing and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's just a big circle, really, which kind of comes back to the age-old thing of digital and analog and using the best of both worlds.
That takes us up to the point where you decided to go freelance. You gave up the security of having a single employer in order to try and build a wider client base.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, because when I was with Nitin, I was, solely employed by him. I think I was even on PAYE at the time, so I wasn't officially freelance until I got a room, and I was really good friends with another great producer and songwriter called Craig Dodds, and we worked together a lot with different things. He used to get me in to do some programming, drum programming, beat making, vocal comping, and what I found was that I was able then to do work with Craig, and from the people that Craig introduced me to, it was very much being in the right place, I suppose, and the reason for that I must put down to being in studio complexes where there's a community of people working. So at the time, I think I'd had a room in Townhouse Studios, which is not there anymore, but it's in Goldhawk Road, just by Shepherd's Bush, isn't it, I think? And also, I think with Nitin, he had a home studio, and he also moved to Matrix in Parsons Green. And when I was there was a few other people that I started working with. I think I did some work with Steve Robson and a few other people there. And before I knew it, instead of working for one person, I seemed to have like a small network of producers that would, call me up when they needed help with something, or the project was growing, or they needed an extra pair of hands to push it over the line, or something like that. So I think a lot of it was being at these complexes and being someone that was competent and able to do the job that was needed to be done, but also be a person that you can spend so it's a long period of time in the studio and not wind someone up the wrong way. I think it's like Kenny Denton was telling me that he reckons that he says about 40% of the job is knowing the technical side of things, but it's the other 60% which is being that kind of person that, people want around. Do you know what I mean? It can just be, you could be the greatest engineer in the world, but, if you can't get on with people, you're not going to be working. Yeah, going back to the question, I think it's complexes, and I think there's a lot of them now. Especially, I think the biggest one in London is probably Tileyard in King's Cross. I think I heard not just studios but offices. I think they have about 75 rooms there or something like that, and it's and growing. So it's a great hub of meeting people, networking, and there's an art, I think, of networking. I don't think I've mastered it at all, but it's the kind of talking about work, getting work, but not seeming like that's what you're doing. It's a really, really strange thing, especially with the music business. If you really want something and chase it, and are seen to be doing so, it's almost frowned upon. It's really weird. Like in every other business aspect, that would be completely normal.
Yeah, I guess you've got to be able to take opportunities without coming across as pushy. You've also got to be able to be in the same room as other people for 12 hours at a time and be creative without actually wanting to kill each other.
Yeah, because all barriers have to be broken down, I think, including things like ego and stuff like that, because that can just really kill a creative process. And I think as an engineer, you really do need to understand what the goal is that everyone's trying to get to. And musically, if you understand someone or are into the same thing, or you find something quite challenging about the work, whether it's the technically or artistically, but somehow that's a problem that you need to solve. And I think it bonds people together, because it's because you're kind of solving these puzzles at the same time.
So the fact that more and more records are being made at home rather than in commercial studios kind of undermines that a bit.
Yeah, I think so too. I think there's, working at home is great for, getting your ideas together. And, but even then, I do think, I don't think there's many great records made by committee. I think there needs a common sort of goal of either an artist or producer that really knows where they want to go with something. But I do feel having a team of people around you sharing that common goal is a much better situation than one size fits all, or one guy trying to do everything. I think there's some, especially in certain genres of music, I think there used to be, maybe not so much now, but if the producer hadn't recorded it, written it, mixed it, mastered it, then they weren't really, proper. It's ridiculous now, because it's, you got bouncing ideas off other people and using people's skills where if you lack in a certain area and you've got someone that picks that area up, then that's great,
So that next stage where you make the decision to get out on your own and break out into a kind of wider creative community, that moment seems to make a massive difference to people. That's a defining moment for you.
Oh yeah, definitely, because that's the moment where you're essentially on your own, because you've always been under the cover or wing of someone else that's, you can rely on to a certain degree. And then when you suddenly go freelance, and now you've got to do your own invoices, sort your own tax out, and pay rent on not just your home but your studio space as well, the costs can mount quite quickly. And if you're not bringing in enough to cover all of that, then it can very, very quickly get to a situation where it's like, I've got to let this go and step down. So it's very sort of, not step down forever, but just, to make ends meet, you might have to let go of the studio for a little bit. But it's it can be really tough, especially when starting out like that. When you make that jump to freelance, it can be so daunting. It depends what area you're going into. As a producer, do you need your own room? I don't know, really. I know a lot of producers that had their own rooms, and now they write a lot of stuff at home, and then they'll meet up in a nice sounding treated room and record the vocals. But then if you're mixing, then that's different, because you need your tools, you need everything else. So it depends what field you're going into, but definitely that kind of moving from the security of a monthly payment to freelance and figuring out when the next pay's coming in is one of the most daunting things I think I've ever done.
How do you define yourself now and the role of mix engineer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm purely a mix engineer, but I think you also have to kind of not limit yourself to just one role. So, like I said before, if there's like producers that have been in a writing room recording vocals and they've got their track together, there's kind of like this kind of gap, I think, between that section there and then going to mix. There's this kind of like post-production part that sometimes doesn't quite get done. So that's great for me, because that's something I can do. I can take the tracks that are already kind of there. They need a mix, but they also need a little bit of something else. Maybe it's like an arrangement in the tune, or maybe it's some additional parts or layering on whatever it may be. So my role is primarily a mix engineer, but there's a lot more additional production happening at the moment, I think, just with the way that everything's set up, with rooms and a lot of people at home and things like that. So I mean, I didn't know I was a mix engineer for ages. I was a recording engineer for a long time when I was working in the studios, and then I wanted to be a producer, and I loved making tunes and making records, but it was I was always torn between the sort of artistic and technical side, because I'd been travelling that road, for so many years, and the technical side of stuff it fascinated me, and the artistic side did as well, but I just had to play to my strengths, to be honest, which was so that's why I've ended up a mix engineer, not a superstar producer.
So a really big question is, what makes the difference between success and failure in this kind of role? What's your USP? What makes you special and ultimately, I suppose, employable?
I think you've got to treat every mix like it could be your last, because I really do think you're constantly judged on pretty much the last thing that you've put out, because it's even if you've got, I don't know if that's necessarily true actually, but I do think that if any time you get complacent, especially with an existing client that's you've been with for a long period of time, even though it feels like that will never end, it always can. That is something that you really do need to realise and not take for granted, because at any point, that long-term client that you're best friends with and making up quite a large percentage of your income. I mean, if you imagine that just went, then it would be a really, really big problem. So I think you can never take anything for granted, and always make sure that the last thing you work on or mix or do or produce or whatever is you've turned over every possible stone to see, to make sure that there's nothing you've missed out or made a mistake on or doesn't quite sound right, or it's just you have to cover every single base, because I think someone was telling me it was unrelated to music, but seeing as you're talking more on the business side, he said to me, if you have a client that makes up to 30% of your income, then that's a problem, because if that client disappears, goes, you fall out, whatever happens, then that's 30% of your income gone, which usually for most people, especially in London, I think, that's then you can't afford your rent sort of thing. So I think spreading your bets is a much safer place to be in, but it's hard work because obviously, there's a lot of people to please and make happy. And with those clients, it's not just that the artist of, as you know, when it comes with major labels and managers and radio pluggers, and you do then have to start pleasing the committee.
That's fantastic, Dean. Thanks very much. Very informative, very interesting, and I'm sure it will be really useful to anyone considering this sort of career. This has been the Sound on Sound podcast with mix engineer Dean James Barratt. Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes page for this episode, where you'll find further information along with web links and details of all the other episodes. And just before you go, let me point you to the soundonsound.com/podcast website page, where you can explore what's playing on our other channels.